this is Ken with Ninjas in Nature, and today we're going to talk a little bit about woodworking. So if you're going to be making an ancient ninja tool, what you're going to want to do is go find a forest or a place where you can gather wood. Before you gather, you want to do a little research. You're going to want a hardwood. So what are hardwoods? So there are things, species like oaks, hickory, ash, maple. Do a little research. Figure out what are the hardwoods in your area. Things like conifers, such as pine trees, cedars, hemlocks, they tend to be a little softer. And for the tool use we're going to do, if you have a softwood, it's likely going to break when you start to train with it. So we want hardwood. So where do you want to get your wood? So we recommend not just grabbing sticks off the ground, because likely these pieces of wood are going to be in some form of decay and are not going to be the strongest things that you want. So ideally look for things that are green. By green we mean they're still growing. You can harvest a single branch, you can harvest a small tree or shrub if you want. But when you're harvesting the wood, there's some things to think about. We like to talk about what is called tending the wild. So what does that mean? It means think about yourself as a farmer of the forest, so to speak, because these trees that you choose are going to affect the other trees in the forest. If you remove some trees, then other trees are going to have eventually more sunlight. So I like to think about things such as where are the trees all crowded out, where are they competing for sunlight, which if you're making a tool, that's actually a good thing to think about, because where the trees are growing in tight clusters and they're all competing in the forest for sunlight, like a place like this is pretty shady, then they're not going to grow as fast. And what that means for the wood is, if you've ever cut a piece of wood and across and looked and counted the rings, those are growth rings. Every year you get a new growth ring. Where they're growing in the shade, they're going to grow slower. So that means there's going to be smaller growth rings, which actually are going to be tighter growth rings, and that means it's going to make the wood actually stronger than if it was growing in full sunlight, because it would grow really fast and put on a lot of wood fast. So that's not going to be as strong. So shady forests can mean a stronger tool for you. Some other things to think about: I like to look for branches that might have been broken by the wind that are still green. You can use those. You can also use what we call seasoned or dried out wood. There are advantages and disadvantages to seasoned wood or dried wood. When wood dries out, the bark is going to tighten up around the wood, and if you cut a piece of wood and leave the bark on, you can dry it by leaving the bark on and standing it upright, and most of the moisture is going to go out the end if you stand it upright, just like the tree we're growing, because the moisture goes up and down the trunk of the branches or the tree. That can be good to avoid splitting of the wood eventually. If you harvest a green piece of wood, meaning a living piece of wood, and work it really fast, it can split as it dries out, if it dries out really fast. It depends on the season. In the spring, especially early spring, there's a lot of liquid going up into the trees. So if you harvest wood then, it's going to have a lot more moisture. It's going to dry out a lot faster versus if you harvest it in the winter. So these are just some things to think about when you harvest, where you harvest. If you harvest a piece of dried wood, say from a branch, avoid getting stuff on the ground because it could be decomposing. If you see like a dead branch that's not too old but looks like it might have just broken, you can harvest that, and the wood, if it's dried out, the bark's going to be harder to carve off. So it'll be a little more work that way. But the other advantage, though, is that it's going to be less likely to crack. And you can actually use tools like wood files on those. We use tools called Shinto rasps for working with green wood, which we'll show you. But if you just have regular wood files, it's going to work a little easier, and the file's not going to get clogged up. So these are a few tips that you can think about when gathering your wood. So go find a piece of wood. When you go to gather wood for making your tools, it's really good to have an awareness of the hazards of the forest. If you're cutting down small trees or branches, are there dead, overhanging limbs above you? Where are the wasps and the hornets that are nesting? And what are the poisonous plants like this vine growing up this tree that can be found in your local forest? Depending on where you live, some trees can cause severe irritations or rashes just from touching them or from the sap in the trees. So do a little research before you go.